The meeting will now come to order. The first item on our agenda is a reading from the Minute Book.
Heather, let's talk the golden age of goats. Let's talk about the golden age of fraternalism, because this is really when we get the idea of fraternalism and goats, and we have a goat for our logo. And what a better way to kick off a Minute Book than to talk about this key part of fraternal history and the rise and fall of the goat.
Oh, absolutely. I love myself a goat trinket or a goat story or anything at all about goats. I wrote an article ages ago for the Scottish Rite Journal about goats and just loved exploring that history and why that became a thing back in the day.
Yeah, so back in the day, in this case, as we talk about the golden age of fraternalism, we're really talking about the last third of the 19th century into maybe the first 20 years of the 20th century, certainly pre-Depression. Once the roaring 20s hit, Depression hits, fraternalism is out, and really post-Civil War. So 1865, 1870 till about 1930. So a 50, 60-year period really makes up the golden age of fraternalism as we recognize it, when about 40% of adult males were members of a fraternal organization.
For sure. This is when membership really hit its peak throughout America. And it seems like if you look at the newspapers of the day, it's like a new order popped up every single day, every week. And I read somewhere recently that there were over 600 different orders in America at that time. And I can't even imagine, you and I collect those books that have lists of all these groups, and there's not even that many listed. So I can't even imagine what all those groups were for and who joined them and what they were doing.
So when you think about the time period, there's kind of three distinct periods in fraternal history in America as we know it. There's the old world of fraternalism, which is the Freemasons, the Odd Fellows, the really old fraternal orders. Certainly anything I'd say, 1830s, 1850s. Those are the groups that have just been around a long time. They're very well established, relatively prestigious in the scheme of things.
Sure. So Knights of Pythias?
Yeah, Knights of Pythias are in there. They're for, Knights of Pythias, we could probably make an argument on. They're 1864 as a start. So they're at the end of that old era and kind of a bridge into the golden age of fraternalism.
Okay.
Then we really hit the golden age, certainly in that Civil War period until we talk about the 1920s. That's when we see, right at the beginning, the Knights of Pythias, the Patrons of Husbandry, the Grange, the Elks, the Knights of Columbus in the 1880s, starting into the animal lodges with the moose and the eagles and the owls.
The lions.
The lions. We get the Woodmen of the World. The Lions, I think, are also form an interesting bridge there because of their time period. Certainly by the time we hit 1900, 1905, we start seeing the rise of civic clubs that are fraternal-like. So the Rotary, the Lions, the service clubs, the Kiwanis, they're taking parts of fraternalism. And those are the organizations that we see really survive that 1930 drop in fraternalism. It's those civic clubs born out of the fraternal movement that then go on to really heights in the 60s, 70s, and 80s here in the States.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Well, and membership during this time, of course, many of these orders were only open to men. Of course, we had parallel organizations with women and youth and people of color and all kinds of other religious traditions that maybe weren't necessarily Christian, but membership was usually based on some sort of faith tradition or their professions or some sort of shared values.
It's funny, I'm training to be a licensed insurance producer for my day job, which I really am not interested in producing insurance, but it's part of it. And there's a discussion in there about fraternal insurance groups, and that was certainly an important part of this as well, was banding together for the purpose of insurance. And even today, when they teach you about insurance and risk, they talk about it as a natural group, meaning a group not put together just for the purpose of buying insurance, which really some of these organizations became by the end, but they used the guise of being a fraternal organization. Well, we're not here just to buy insurance. We also have a ritual and a club. And then we also happen to buy a lot of insurance. that really became an important part of the social safety net that these organizations provided during the Golden Age.
Certainly. And we didn't have health insurance back in the day. People always ask us, what's up with the insurance? And it's because we just didn't have the same kind of welfare system. And with the United States rapidly industrializing, work was a lot more dangerous. There were people in factories, there were people traveling for work. There was a lot more danger involved in what it took to go to the workplace. And so this was a way to protect widows, orphans, and the family that was left at home.
Yeah, it's the whole of that insurance movement crosses so many of these fraternal societies. Generally, the Masons didn't play in insurance, and the Oddfellows did just to a very minor extent. But almost all of the other organizations had an insurance component, and oftentimes because the people they served had no other opportunities for insurance. Like you mentioned, this really was their social safety net. When you think about the Golden Age and the fraternal organizations that existed, in my mind, they really fall into one of 6 buckets, and bear with me while I describe. 3 of these buckets have everything to do with not being a white guy. That's the organizations made for ethnic organizations. So HEPA, the Greek life, the Filipino movements in California, groups really banded together around an ethnic heritage. Gender-based groups, so women's groups, and there were certainly many of those that were out there that whether or not they were affiliated to another fraternal group or not, they operated independently as a women's group. And then beyond just the ethnic organizations, certainly color-based organizations with African-American or Latino alternatives to some of the mainstream fraternal organizations that were out there. So there's 3 buckets. And then, as you and I like to joke, the old white guy side of this, we get 3 distinct buckets that really become a class thing on the Caucasian side, where you've got sort of the lower working class, and I don't mean lower in a pejorative sense, just economic class of groups. And broadly speaking, these are where the labor unions and the Oddfellows and some of those groups came in. The middle class groups that were the merchant class, we see this often with the Knights of Pythias, the animal lodges, they sort of fulfill that. And then there's some upper class thrust groups. Freemasons generally thought of this way, although not necessarily in the grand scheme of things, but also things like the Sons of the American Revolution, or organizations that required some genetic background to have good American heritage, so to speak. So does that resonate with you with the kind of those distinct classifications?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that, at the same time, all of these groups kind of were springing out of each other. Some of the founders of some of the other groups happened to be either Freemasons or Oddfellows, and they really took what they had learned in those other organizations and formed these rituals and secrets and things based on what they had already learned at their Masonic lodge. And even some of the women's and youth groups were based off of what was originally done in a Masonic lodge. And I find that always kind of cool. And even Greek life, when we talk the college world, from my own experience, it's something that is definitely modeled off of a Masonic lodge. Even the way we sit in a chapter meeting, it could be held in a lodge room and you'd feel right at home.
It's easy to forget that by 1900, around the turn of the century, as prominent as the Freemasons are today, the Oddfellows were the largest group during the Golden Age of fraternalism, with close to 1 million members or more. I don't have my chart in front of me. Go back and find my Stevens Encyclopedia of fraternal organizations, but a huge number of members here in the United States, certainly far more influential across the country than the Freemasons. And they had a national body. They had a sovereign Grand Master that was ruling the entire country, where the Freemasons were independent state by state. And I think that's, as we chart some of the rise and fall through the Golden Age of fraternalism, the groups that had a more decentralized governance structure tended to survive a little bit better. So I think they were able to adapt and adjust state by state, or whatever the jurisdiction was. Whereas those national groups were trying to steer an awfully big ship and weren't necessarily able to be agile and change with the times. So as we think, we've talked rise of the fraternal movements in the 60s, and for Minute Book, we don't want to go too long here, but to kind of wrap up key ideas on this, we talked rise, and we've talked about the Golden Age, where all these groups sprung. So the question is, what happened? Why did the Golden Age end? Every Golden Age has to end. I think in general, there's, in my view, and I'd be interested in your take on this, two things happened. Well, let's say three things, because we like threes. We're good Masons, right? Everything comes with threes. First, as we noted earlier, the Depression. There was an economic component to this, that the economy tanked. Paying dues became a luxury, not a necessity, something that wasn't necessarily part of everybody's daily life. So that didn't help. That was immediately followed by the New Deal and the Progressive Era, where things like insurance were now being taken care of by the government. And I would even go so far as to argue with the youth groups and some of the other things in the community. At one time, the school didn't have the band or the football team. That was things a community organization did. And then the schools took those functions over. So we had the Progressive Era and kind of that change in government. And lastly, I think, and probably most controversially, I would argue to a certain extent, the Klan killed the fraternal movement. When it remodeled itself in 1915 as a fraternal group rather than the horrific anti-Semitic and anti-African American group, that white nationalist group that it was, it tried to be fraternal. And then when it got unmasked as being just a cover for being fraternal, there's a bit of blowback on the fraternal movement there. So between the economy, the government taking on more, and kind of a perversion of the good parts of fraternalism for a very ugly purpose, I think that really, those three things caused the decline of fraternalism in the late 20s and early 30s.
Certainly. And I would add a few things to that. So definitely the Depression, but then we also had some war, and that took people away and brought them back. It also created a renewal in fraternalism a few years later because people were coming back and looking for things to do. And then social activities just really changed. So like you were saying, the communities used to do sports and things like that, and then it moved to the schools. But then think about the theater and television and things like that. They weren't a thing when the golden age of fraternalism was around, and vaudeville kind of kicked off this really cool interest in doing these plays in these fraternal groups. But then as that moved to the movies, they didn't need that same kind of entertainment. They were getting it from Hollywood. And then suburbanization also contributed to changes in how people were living. So you used to have the town square, and the lodges were on the town square. So you'd see your Oddfellows and your Pythians and your Masons and other groups like all there together on the downtown square. And that's where people would spend their evenings after work. And that changed when people started moving outside of the city. They didn't want to come back in to go to another meeting or another thing that night. They wanted to go home to their family and then do it all over the next day. And so that really started breaking apart those norms that had been part of American culture for so long.
So you heard it here first, folks. Heather is very much in favor of DVD degrees on television. That's what I'm hearing.
No. That's horrible.
You made a great point, Heather, and I think a good way to wrap up that we love this golden age of fraternalism, but really there's been a couple of these golden ages. There was certainly the 1700s when the Masons and the Oddfellows were formed. Then we had this golden age that we're talking about now. And then there was sort of a second golden age that happened in the 60s and the 70s, when certainly the Freemasons became the giant organization they were. And as we talked earlier, the Kiwanis and the Elks, that's when they really peaked out in membership, was in the 60s and 70s. And some folks today, while our numbers are certainly not what they used to be in fraternalism, there does seem to be a bit of a rebound, right? There's interest in fraternalism all the way around. And instead of guys being just a member of the Pythians and really into being a Pythian, now they're a member of 3 and 4 and 5 of these organizations because they're really into the idea of it and a connection to the previous generations.
For sure. And I think that that's probably what it was like in this golden age that we're talking about. I think, we talk about, they were Masons or they were this or that. But actually, when you look at their obituaries, they were members of so many clubs and groups. And it's kind of cool I love hunting through those old newspapers and reading about these guys who were officers of 3 or 4 or 5 different groups.
So perhaps we're in a, maybe not a new golden age, but a new age of fraternalism. And certainly from where we sit, I think Minute Book is part of that. and part of that rebound. And we look forward to many more episodes in the future to talk about what fraternalism was, what it meant to folks, and what it is today, and how it continues to be an important part of society.
For sure. Well, thanks for talking today, Seth.
Absolutely. Look forward to the next episode.
With no further business before us, I hereby declare this meeting adjourned. Until next time on Minute Book.